Hello, my name is Dan Roby and I am the webmaster for a website called wvncrails.org. Back in 2011, I wrote a website piece about the Ripley and Mill Creek Valley Railroad, later taken over by the B&O Railroad. And I am here at the invitation of Ripley to create this virtual video tour of the railroad. So we are going to take a railroad trip from Millwood to Ripley back in time. During the late 1800s, there was a great industrial expansion. All cities of any size wanted the railroad to serve their town and their respective communities, quite like what the interstate highways do in the modern era. There was an original $250,000 bond for the construction of the railroad. Once that was done, it was just a matter of acquiring the right-of-way. So eager were the residents of Jackson County between Ripley and Millwood to have a railroad that landowners willingly granted right-of-way for the construction of the line. And eventually construction commenced and the railroad was completed in 1888. The total length of the railroad was 12.9, so roughly just call it 13 miles. The earliest major industry to develop here will come as a surprise to most people. Most people associate timbering with the central and northern parts of West Virginia, but Jackson County actually in its early history was a major source of timber. That was a primary source of origin and revenue for the railroad. This was in an era before there were good roads. Not too many people owned automobiles. The vast majority of travel in the early years was still by horse and cart. So the railroad was the great modern amenity during the early 1900s at least into the 1930s. You had Post-Pinnell Planing Mill, Jackson County Grocers, Standard Oil, and of course the largest, most consistent one was the Ripley livestock market. The largest center at that time was Cincinnati, and that livestock would be brought into Ripley here, loaded on trains, and then it would make connections to go to Cincinnati to markets there. The primary stops of commercial and passenger importance, scheduled stops, would have been Millwood, Cottageville, Evans, and Ripley. Other stops along the line, whistle stops or so-called flag stops, would have been Cushing's, and Girona, Wesley Chapel, and Parchment. We're standing at Millwood, West Virginia. This was the junction of the Mill Creek and Ripley and Mill Creek Valley Railroad with at that time, the Ohio River Railroad. When the Ohio River Railroad was completed, during this section of that railroad was completed to Millwood by 1884. And it was at that time that the interest had spawned to construct the Ripley and Mill Creek Valley Railroad into Ripley. This became the junction and the connection to the outside world. In 1912, both lines were taken over by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, more commonly known as the B&O, and it remained in B&O ownership up until the 1970s when it was merged with the Chessie system. And today this railroad is still active under the CSX transportation. Millwood was a thriving junction. The railroad was moderately busy. There was manifest traffic on the line between Wheeling and Canova. It also included Parkersburg and Point Pleasant, all of the river cities. At its peak, there were 6 scheduled passenger trains a day. In addition, you had the daily train to Ripley. In its very early history, for a brief period of time, there were actually 3 scheduled trains into Ripley daily near the turn of the century. Ultimately, that decreased to where there was only 1 operating. Right now, we're standing at what was the east connection of the Ripley branch. The gravel road is actually the former railroad right-of-way where it swung around in a wide arcing curve, and this was the east connection on what's called a Railroad Y. One would never know it now, but this is where the Millwood Depot stood. Years of growth have totally obscured any traces of the structure here that we're able to readily see. The size of these trees will indicate how long the depot has been gone. It was demolished during the early 1960s. So we're looking at a time period of well over 50 years ago that since the depot stood here. My mother lived right here at Millwood. She grew up here. Her mother worked at the post office here, so they had a direct connection with the railroad here. My mother's house was in proximity to the railroad here, and all during the Depression era, the hobos would ride the rails and they would stop off wherever they could sleep or wait for a next train, but more importantly, they would look for places they could forage food. And at my mother's home, where she grew up as a young girl, hobos would frequent the house there asking for anything they could get. Food, vegetables, fruits, anything, any type of sustenance to keep them going. After we leave Millwood, as we move east toward Ripley, the next timetable location would be Cushing's. It is noteworthy as far as the railroad itself went, because it was at that location that the sharpest curve in the railroad was located, a 20-degree turn. That turn would have facilitated a drop in speed probably down to 5 miles per hour. We are standing in Cottageville. This was the first significant stop east of Millwood, headed toward Ripley. And at one time, this was a large center of agriculture here, a farming community that depended heavily on the railroad. The railroad, in the early 1900s, the railroad had converted makeshift boxcars and turned them into basically a freight station as well, passenger and as far as freight station, and used those in lieu of building a dedicated structure for that purpose. Union High School was located on what was old US Route 33, what's now 331. It was right there at the railroad crossing. And yes, students would board the train to and from school, because the high school served a larger area, so it was much easier for students at that time to hop on the train for a few cents a day to ride the train back and forth to school. So the railroad did figure prominently as far as the school went here in Cottageville. There is a legend of a B&O engineer who lived to the east of Cottageville, headed between Cottageville and the farmland area referred to as Cow Run. And when the railroad was being abandoned, when the track was being pulled in 1968, people commented the fact they were hearing this mysterious music playing. It would be heard every Christmas Eve in the immediate years after the railroad was removed. And the house that the man lived in was adjacent to the railroad, and when the railroad was removed, that house was demolished as well. So maybe it was a very unhappy spirit. We are in the area between Cottageville and Evans. This area technically is known as Girona. We're in some farmland area here where this trestle directly behind me crosses a creek known as Cow Run. When originally constructed, the Ripley Mill Creek Valley Railroad consisted of 13 trestles of varying sizes. The one standing here at Cow Run is among the largest ones, and it is also the only one still in existence. Moving east from this structure, we pass through farmland and then we approach the hilly section of Girona. There, the railroad met the steepest grades on the entire route, and trains would have to make a run for the grade to reach the summit, depending on how big the train was, how heavy their consist was, what the tonnage was. Aside from the sharp curve at Cushing's, the greatest obstacle that challenged trains on the Ripley branch were the grades at Girona. At the Otterbein Cemetery, in the area between Girona and the town of Evans, this is located along Evans Road. Westbound trains coming from Ripley would build up steam. They would accelerate and get enough speed, depending on the tonnage of their train, to ensure that they could make it over this grade. Of significance over on this side is this large pasture. This vast openness here at one time was the Jackson County Fairground. There was actually a timetable stop here on the railroad itself. When the fair was actually in progress, the train would stop here at Otterbein at a whistle stop that was actually called Fairground, to let disembark passengers and pick up passengers to and from the fair when it was going on. Of course, the centerpiece here, this landmark for so many years, is the Otterbein Church itself that was built in 1896. The church is still in reasonably good condition, and as a matter of fact, it is preserved on the National Register of Historic Places. We're looking east along Evans Road, and you can trace the railroad right away. This was the longest tangent on the entire railroad. Straightest stretch of railroad between Millwood and Ripley was this section along the road right here. And my father, he grew up at Evans, so he saw the trains coming and going to and from Ripley on a virtual daily basis. Moving east from Evans, the railroad followed the contour of what is present-day West Virginia Route 87, and in the area of Rawlins Lake, which is this beautiful body of water to my back, it swung around on the far side, on the far end of the lake, and continued moving eastward over into the area which is known as Parchment Valley. And at that point, the railroad continued paralleling Mill Creek all the way into Ripley for it was probably another 4 miles or so into town directly. This would be the west side of the structure, and this was the primary passenger platform here. At one time, if you look in especially the archival photos, you'll see a loading dock on this. Obviously, that has been long removed. But when the train would arrive, it would pull right through, and depending on how many coaches and cars were with the train at any given date, the locomotive would end up usually about right where we're standing right here. On December 16th, 1897, all those people flocked here to Ripley for the last public execution in the state of West Virginia. Probably that was the greatest ridership of passenger on the passenger train on the Ripley at any given time. There probably was not a seat to be found on that train. There were actually a couple of different tracks here at the depot. There was one on this side and one on the opposite side. The track that used to exist here was used primarily for freight and baggage. The door is still visible on the side of the depot, and as also the supports for the loading dock. And boxcars will be spotted here, and they would be unloaded with general merchandise, specifically for shippers that were not served by a spur themselves. This was the primary function of the track that was located on this side. The Ripley water treatment plant occupies the area where the turntable was once located. And when trains would come in, and we're talking about steam locomotives, unlike diesels where they could run forward and backward without any difficulty, with steam locomotives, the locomotive would come in, the train would come into town, and it would be facing toward the end of the line, and it had to be turned for the return trip back to Millwood. So once the train was would complete its work, it dropped passengers off or dropped freight off here at the depot. They would uncouple the locomotive from the cars, back the locomotive up to the turntable, which is located probably a quarter of a mile from the actual depot itself, and it will be spun on the turntable, and then it will be backed into the station, but it will be facing forward for the return trip to Millwood. The demise began in earnest during the 1950s in the post-World War II era. At that time, there had been significant progress made with the highway system. More people were purchasing automobiles. The trucking industry had made inroads, and that really cut into the business and the source of revenue for the Ripley branch. The last day of operation here on the Ripley branch was April 12, 1963. And from that point onward, the railroad was relegated to history.